This is a cycle archetype, this is a bridge spam archetype, and this is a branded archetype. But what is an archetype? An archetype is a category of decks that share a similar playstyle, win conditions, and weaknesses. For example, Hog Rider and Royal Hogs decks are both cycle decks, because they focus on quickly cycling back to their win condition to deal cheap damage. Understanding archetypes is key to improving in Clash Royale. Why? Because it lets you predict your opponent's next move. If you're up against a beatdown deck, you can expect them to drop their Lava Hound or Golem when double Elixir starts, so you should be ready to counter push the other lane. Let's start with the most hated. Beatdown decks are decks that build up a big push by playing cards behind the king tower. This way, by the time your troops reach the bridge, you have enough elixir to either defend or support your push effectively. The goal of these decks is to win the game with a single push and ruin people's lives. You have to overwhelm your opponent with a high cost or medium sized tank, like Golem, Lava Hound or Giant, supported by high damage troops like Phoenix or Nightwitch, and supported by crowd control cards like Tornado. To play these decks correctly, you need to pay attention to your opponent's counters. For example, if you push with Elixir Golem and you know your opponent has evolved Electro Dragon, save enough Elixir for a lightning spell. This could take out their counter and help secure their tower. In 99% of cases, you should start your push from behind your king tower. This lets you generate more Elixir and prepare a stronger attack. The exact timing depends on the deck and matchup, but usually you should attack more in double Elixir, since you have more resources to defeat the opponent. What about a single Elixir? You can still attack, but you need to be more careful. Focus on punishing mistakes and getting positive elixir trips to set up a counter push. The most important thing is probably timing. If you mistime your push, you will lose the game. Simple as that. Drop your tank too early and your opponent will easily defend. Wait too long and you might not have enough time to break through. Great beatdown players know exactly when to commit. They don't just spam a push, they wait for the right moment, when the opponent is low on elixir or has used key defensive cards. There are many beatdown variations, since they mix with other sub-archetypes, but they are usually identified by their main tank: Giant, Electro Giant, Lava Hound, Golem, Goblin Giant, and Elixir Golem. One last thing, Elixir Golem is different. Since it costs less elixir, it can be used for surprise pushes. Also, don't confuse Royal Giant with Beatdown. We'll talk about that later. Cycle decks are played at a very fast pace, focusing on cycling your win condition, key defensive cards, and defensive building as quickly as possible. So in short, they spam every possible card to play their Hog Rider 1 billion times. These decks are built around a low cost win condition, a low cost spell, usually Snowball or Log, and a medium damage spell, like Royal Delivery, Fireball or Poison. They also include a cheap defensive building, such as Cannon or Tesla. The rest of the deck is filled with low-cost cycle cards, like Skeletons and Spirits, allowing you to play your main cards more frequently. The goal of a cycle deck is to deal cheap damage with your weak condition while maintaining a strong defense. Unlike beatdown decks, cycle decks usually aim to take down just one tower, so many games go into overtime. Knowing your card cycle and managing elixir correctly is essential. Always be aware of how much elixir you need for defense and whether you can counter push effectively without overcommitting. Cycle decks rely on quick rotations, so wasting elixir or mismanaging your cycle can leave you in danger. Another tip is to switch lanes strategically, especially against beatdown decks. Attacking the opposite lane forces your opponent to split their push. If they switch lanes, you should often do the same, even if their tower has lower HP. Preserving your defensive cards is more important than overcommitting in a single lane. Finally, card placement and elixir trades play a crucial role. Proper positioning can decide the outcome of most games, and understanding interactions allows you to maximize efficiency. For example, you can fully counter a Mega Knight using just 2 elixir and your tower troops, while also activating your King Tower. The most important skill is hard to say, but knowing interaction is probably the most critical. If you don't understand how different cards interact, other key aspects, like elixir management, will be much harder to master. The 3 most common cycle decks are Hog Rider Cycle, Miner Poison Cycle, and Balloon Cycle. However, remember that cycle decks are mainly identified by their low average elixir cost. Some cycle decks may also belong to another archetype, such as Expo Cycle and Logbait, but in general, they all feature low-cost card and a cheap defensive building. Bait decks focus on forcing the opponent to waste their spells, creating opportunities to counter-push when the key counters are out of rotation. Unlike other decks that use a variety of defensive options, bait decks rely on repetitive threats to pressure the enemy into misusing the resources, or at least this was the case before the introduction of Evil Goblin Barrel, where the deck transformed into a split lane push deck. Please, delete Evo Barrel. There are 2 main types of bait decks, log bait and fireball bait. Log bait decks aim to force out the opponent's log by using cards like Goblin, Goblin Gang, and Princess. Once the luck is out of cycle, the Goblin Barrel become a deadly win condition, chipping away at the tower. To support this strategy, Inferno Tower is often used as the defensive building. If the opponent has Zap instead of Log, even the tower itself can act as a bait, forcing them to stop it instead of saving for a different situation. Cannon and Tesla are also viable, cheaper defensive options. A key element of Log bait decks is the mini tank, like Knight and Valkyrie. Fireball bait decks, on the other hand, flood the board with units that are vulnerable to Fireball, like Magic Archer, Zappies, and Barbarians. The win condition is typically Royal Hogs or 3 Musketeers, forcing the opponent to split their damage across 2 lanes. Because these decks often result in split lane pushes, it's crucial to understand how to defend against them properly. I will talk about this better later. Success with a bait deck depends on predicting when the opponent will use their spells and taking advantage of it. Always track their card cycle and be ready to apply pressure when the main counter is unavailable. Another tip is to create bad trades for your opponent by presenting multiple threats at once. This can exploit hesitation or force inefficient spell usage, giving you an elixir advantage and better positional control. Finally, reading and predicting your opponent is essential. The best bait decks players excel at recognizing spell usage patterns and adjusting their strategy mid-game to keep up the pressure, ensuring they always have the upper hand. The most important skill, mastering bait decks predictive play. This strategic playstyle rewards those who can outsmart their opponents, making every move count. Control decks are a hybrid of Beatdown and Cycle, because they are essentially a more expensive Cycle deck. They aim to do great defenses and do some cheap damage with counter attacks or capitalizing on enemies' mistakes. Control decks typically rely on fast reacting win conditions that can be played at the right moment to punish overcommitted opponents. Some of the most effective options include Graveyard, which pairs with a tank like Knight or Skeleton King, and Royal Giant. Goblin Drill offers a tricky, hard to defend option that fits well into control strategies. Hog Rider is also a staple. To support this win condition, control decks often include defensive troops such as Ice Wizard or Archers. Some well-known variants include Royal Giant Cycle, which uses quick rotation and steady pressure to dictate the pace of the game, and Lumberloon, a hybrid of strong defense and counter push potential. Splashyard stands out as a defensive powerhouse, utilizing Graveyard as its win condition. Siege decks are a type of deck that focuses on offensive buildings as the primary win condition. These decks rely on placing long-range structures that can damage enemy towers from your side of the arena, forcing opponents to react and adjust their strategy. The main goal of a siege deck is to deal consistent damage to enemy towers while preventing the opponent from launching a strong counterattack. Remember that even if everyone hates you, I will always be by your side. Expo players, we have to stand our ground. Siege decks typically rely on a combination of offensive buildings, support troops, spells, and cheap cycled cards to maintain pressure and control the battlefield. The main win conditions are Expo and Mortar. To play a siege deck effectively, managing elixir efficiently is key. Proper building placement ensures they remain protected while maintaining offensive pressure. Another important aspect is adapting to the opponent. Knowing when to attack and when to defend is crucial. Tracking the opponent's card cycle helps identify moments when they lack counters to Expo or Mortar, allowing for an effective push. Finally, defending efficiently and achieving positive elixir traits enables faster cycling back to the win condition, keeping the pressure constant. The key to success with a siege deck is controlling the pace of the match, knowing when to switch from defense to offense. The most common Expo deck is the Expo 3.0 cycle. A more defensive option is Icebow, which focuses on control-based gameplay and uses rocket for guaranteed damage when needed. Mortar cycle offers a cheaper alternative, utilizing Mortar as the primary win condition. The split lane deck archetype is built around attacking both lanes simultaneously to pressure the opponent's defense. Split lane decks utilize cards that can be divided across both lanes, such as the Three Musketeers, Royal Hogs, and the most unskilled card in the game. The primary goal of a split lane deck is to overwhelm the opponent by forcing them to defend both lanes at once. Elixir Collector is sometimes included to bait out spells and gain an elixir advantage. Flying Machine and Magic Archer serve as support troops. Vapis and Minion Horde are also great assets, acting as bait for medium spells while being useful in both offensive and defensive scenarios. Creating dual lane pressure is key. Avoid focusing on a single lane and instead distribute your troops across both lanes to keep the opponent guessing. Baiting medium spells like Fireball or Poison is another important strategy, as your opponent will often have only one. Additionally, use defensive plays to build counter pushes in both lanes, keeping constant pressure on the opponent. The defining feature of split lane decks is their ability to force inefficient defensive responses from opponents. Since few decks can effectively counter push in both lanes at once, this archetype thrives on its ability to control the pace of the match. The Three Musketeers plus Elixir Collector variation is a classic beatdown oriented deck. Another variation, Three Musketeers plus Royal Hogs, is more cycle based. The Royal Recruits plus Royal Hogs variation focuses on synergy. Recruits provide a strong defensive backbone, while Hogs continue to pressure the opponent in both lanes. Lastly, the E-Golem cycle variation is a fast cycling deck aimed at deploying 2 golems of Elixir in separate lanes, supported by bats and skeletons. Each variation brings its own strengths, but they all focus on maintaining constant pressure and forcing the opponent to make inefficient defensive plays. Bridge Spam is an aggressive deck archetype that focuses on quickly deploying troops at the bridge to apply instant pressure on the opponent. For example, the opponent who never gives you a second to breathe because they keep spamming troops at the bridge. This strategy forces quick reactions, often leading to mistakes that create an elixir advantage. The deck thrives on relentless attack with fast, high damage units that require little to not set up. The main goal of a bridge spam deck is to continuously send new troops across the bridge. Key cards in these decks include Bandit, which dashes to the target, making her a fast and unpredictable threat, Badoram, and Magic Archer, that provide long-range chip damage and can hit multiple units when positioned correctly. The Electro Wizard is another great addition into these decks. To effectively play bridge spam decks, players need to focus on applying a constant pressure, capitalizing on elixir advantage, and using a counter push potential. Finally, recognizing using key defensive counters is important. The key to success with bridge spam is knowing when to attack and when to hold back. Spamming troops at the wrong moment can lead to massive counter pushes from the opponent. However, striking when the opponent is out of cycle or has just played a high cost card in the back can create an unstoppable wave of pressure that leads to the victory. Bridge spam decks come in different variations, each with slight adjustment based on the meta. Some popular variations include Backup Bridge Spam and Mega Knight Ram Rider. I left it for last because I hope no one plays these decks. The Spawner archetype is a strategic deck style centered around spawner buildings as win condition. This archetype features structures like Goblin Hut, Furnace and Barbarian Hut, which continuously generate troops over time. By deploying these buildings, players create a constant stream of units that apply pressure and force the opponent to allocate resources to defense. The primary goal of a spawner deck is to chip away at the opponent's towers. Additionally, these decks focus on baiting out enemy spells. Spawners deck rely heavily on buildings and support troops to sustain their pressure. To maximize the potential of a spawner deck, players need to focus on establishing a strong defense, baiting out spells, and applying split lane pressure. The key to success with spawner decks is maintaining a constant pressure while controlling the tempo of damage. Opponents who struggle with managing the endless wave of spawned troops will eventually be overwhelmed. Proper elixir management and patience are essential to lasting opponents and slowly chipping away at their towers. Spawner decks come in different forms. The most common one are the Spawner Control with Goblin Hut and Furnace, the heavier Spawner Beatdown that have Barbarian Hut and Tanker troops, and the Spawner Bait Hybrid, who combines spawner decks with spell-bait elements. And these were every Clash Royale deck's archetypes. Understanding how different deck types work won't just help you improve your gameplay, but also predict your opponent's moves more effectively. If you find this video helpful, make sure to watch this video next, where I cover the strongest state of every Clash Royale card.